The auctioneer's voice cut through the October air like a rusted plow blade. Sold 160 acres, $8,000 to the man in the back. A few people laughed, not the polite kind of laugh, the mean kind, the kind that comes from somewhere low in a person, from the part of them that has already decided what is possible and what is not. The year was 1961. The place was Pottawatomie County, Kansas, a stretch of heartland so flat you could watch your dog run away for 3 days. And the man standing in the back of that crowd, clutching a bidding paddle with both hands like it was the last solid thing in the world, was named Eldon Marsh. He was 51 years old, recently widowed, driving a 1953 Ford pickup with a cracked block, and he had just bought the most despised piece of land in the county. Nobody thought he'd ever grow a single thing on it. They were wrong. Let me take you there. Let me put you on that flat Kansas highway in the autumn of 1961, with the windows down and the smell of turned earth and dry grass coming in off the fields. Pottawatomie County sits in the northeastern corner of Kansas, not far from where the Kansas River bends south toward Topeka. In 1961, it was a county of working farms, wheat, sorghum, and a little corn where the water held. The main towns were St. Mary's and Wamego, and between them stretched thousands of acres of productive farmland that had been worked by the same families for 3 and 4 generations. The land itself was, and still is, a particular shade of brown gold in October. The sky above it goes on forever, a pale blue dome with clouds that look like they were drawn by a careful hand. The wind comes steady from the northwest, carrying with it the smell of dust and distance and something faintly sweet, like dying corn stalks after the first hard frost. It was, to most eyes, a beautiful country. But the 160 acres at the end of Timber Creek Road were not beautiful. They had not been farmed in 11 years. Before that, they had been badly strip-cropped during the war years by an absentee owner who'd never set foot on the land himself, a Kansas City speculator named Humphrey who'd bought it as an investment in 1944 and rented it to a series of tenants who farmed it hard and put nothing back. By 1950, the topsoil across most of the northern fields had eroded to near nothing. The remaining soil had a grey-white caliche look to it, chalky, cracked, dead-looking. The south field had been flooded twice and sat under a mat of sedge, grass, ragweed, and volunteer elm saplings. The county extension agent, a man named Dale Furches, had surveyed the property in 1958 as part of a soil conservation study. His official report, still in the Pottawatomie County records, described the land in terms so bleak they might have been describing the surface of the moon. Severe erosion on northern portions, soil pH readings of 4.9 to 5.2, highly acidic, organic matter content less than 0.8%. Not currently suitable for productive agriculture without significant capital investment. When that report made the rounds at the Wamego Co-op, someone tacked it to the bulletin board with a handwritten note underneath. Anybody want 160 acres of nothing, going cheap? They had no idea how right they were about the cheap part. Let me tell you about Eldon Marsh. He was born in 1910, the third son of a tenant farmer outside Onaga, Kansas, a small town about 20 miles north of where this story takes place. His father farmed rented ground his whole life and died without ever owning an acre of it. That fact sat on Eldon like a stone from the time he was old enough to understand it. He was not a large man, 5'9", lean the way farmers get lean not from diet but from work. His hands were the color of saddle leather and the texture of tree bark. He had a quiet face, the kind that didn't give much away, and eyes that were a pale, serious gray. People who knew him said he didn't talk much, but when he did, it meant something. He'd farmed rented ground himself for 22 years, first near Havensville, then down near Louisville, Kansas. He was good at it. His neighbors knew he was good at it. But rented ground is borrowed time, and in 1958, the family he rented from sold out to a larger operation, and Eldon found himself at 48 years old without a farm. His wife, Ruth, had died of a stroke in the spring of 1960, a loss so sudden and complete that people said it took the sound right out of Eldon. He had a daughter, Carol, who'd married a man in Topeka, and a son, Wayne, who was 17 in 1961 and still at home. What Eldon did have, what he'd been building quietly for 2 decades while paying rent, was knowledge. He'd spent his spare hours reading, not just the farm papers and the almanac, though he read those too. He'd gotten hold of a set of soil science textbooks through a mail-order program from Kansas State University, the kind of extension program that existed, quiet and unhyped, for working farmers who wanted to learn. He'd read Sir Albert Howard's An Agricultural Testament, published in 1940, a book about the biology of soil that almost nobody in Pottawatomie County had heard of. He'd read William Albrecht's papers on soil fertility from the University of Missouri. He'd been thinking about soil, really thinking about it, for 15 years. And when he looked at those 160 acres on Timber Creek Road, and everyone else saw death, Eldon Marsh saw a diagnosis. He saw a patient who was sick but not gone. He saw something that could, with time and the right treatment, be brought back. He had $9,200 in a savings account, everything he had in the world. He bid $8,000 for the land and bought it. He kept $1,200 for what came next. Now every story has its shadow, and in this one that shadow had a name and a desk. Gerald Phelan was the vice president of the First National Bank of Wamego, Kansas. He was 44 years old in 1961, a broad-shouldered man who wore pressed shirts every day of the week, drove a new 1961 Buick LeSabre in two-tone white and turquoise, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything in their own telling of it. Phelan's family had been in banking in Pottawatomie County for 2 generations. His father had started the bank. Gerald had taken it over in 1952 and grown it significantly. He had a genuine talent for numbers and an equally genuine talent for letting people know about his talent for numbers. He was not a cruel man exactly, but he was the kind of man who confused certainty with intelligence and liked an audience. He also had significant real estate ambitions. In the late 1950s, Phelan had been quietly assembling farmland in the county, buying distressed properties, combining them with existing profitable farms and renting them out at rates that made him look generous to people who didn't read the fine print. He'd had his eye on the Timber Creek Road property himself, but had decided, based on the extension agent's soil report, that it wasn't worth the carrying cost. You couldn't grow Johnson grass on that dirt, he told people at the Rotary Club. When word got around that Eldon Marsh had bought it, Phelan heard about it the same afternoon. He drove out the next morning not to introduce himself, not to offer help, but to look. He parked his Buick at the edge of the north field, got out, stood with his hands in his pockets, and looked at the cracked grey soil and the weedy south field and the falling down fence line along the creek. Then he went back to Wamego and told 3 separate people, at the hardware store, at the co-op, and at his own bank, that Eldon Marsh had lost his mind, and that the county was about to watch an old widow go broke on 160 acres of Kansas hardpan. He wasn't whispering, he wasn't being privately skeptical, he was performing his skepticism. He wanted credit when the time came for having been right. That soil is dead, Phelan said to anyone who would listen. Has been for a decade. You can't farm dead soil. The man paid $8,000 for a tax burden. That word dead is important, remember it. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't planned. The best ones never are. It was a Saturday morning in March of 1962. The Wamego Farm Supply and Feed Store, a wide, low building on Main Street that smelled of seed corn and mineral supplement and the particular dusty warmth of a wood stove burning in the corner, was the gathering place on Saturday mornings for the farmers of that part of the county. They came to pick up parts and seed, but mostly they came to talk, to compare notes, to complain about the weather, about Washington, about prices. It was, as it was in 1,000 towns like it across America, a kind of open-air parliament for working men. Eldon Marsh came in that morning to pick up 50 pounds of Austrian winter peas and a soil pH test kit. He was quiet, as he usually was. He nodded to the men he knew, which was most of them. Gerald Phelan was there. He'd come in to pick up some fencing supplies for one of his rental properties. He saw Eldon, and he did what men like him do when they've already made a public bet against you. He doubled down. Eldon, Phelan said it loud enough to be heard by the 6 or 7 men standing nearby. How's that dead ground treating you? Eldon looked at him. Fine, he said. Fine, Phelan smiled and looked at the men around him to make sure they were getting this. You put anything in the ground yet? Not yet, Eldon said. Smart, save yourself the seed money. Phelan picked up a fence staple from the bin and turned it in his fingers. Dale Furchess told me that the ground tested out below 5 on the pH. You know what that means. I know what it means, Eldon said. It means it's dead. It means whatever was alive in that soil got farmed out of it 15 years ago, and it isn't coming back. You'd need to lime it 10 tons an acre minimum just to grow weeds. A few of the men laughed, not mean exactly, but the kind of laugh that follows when a confident man has said something that sounds like it might be true. Eldon bought his winter peas and his test kit. At the door, he stopped and turned around. "I'll have a crop on that ground in 3 years," he said, not loudly, not with performance, just as a statement of fact. Phelan raised his eyebrows. "What kind of crop?" "A good one," Eldon said. He walked out. Now that might seem like a quiet moment, a mild exchange, but in a small county in 1962 where everybody knew everybody and Saturday mornings at the feed store were the closest thing to a public stage, that exchange rippled. Phelan repeated it, usually adding details that made him look more impressive and Eldon look more foolish. By the following week, people were treating it as an open wager. Eldon Marsh against the dead ground. The old tenant farmer against the banker who knew the numbers. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been publicly dismissed? Have you ever had someone look you in the eye in front of witnesses and tell you that what you're trying to do isn't possible, and had them do it not with concern but with a kind of pleasure? Because that is what happened to Eldon Marsh in that feed store, and what a man does in the months after that moment, how quietly, how stubbornly, how completely he goes about his work, that is the real story. Let me tell you what Eldon knew that Gerald Phelan did not. Phelan knew numbers. He knew soil pH ratings and per acre yields and commodity prices. These are not small things. These are real and important. But what Phelan didn't know, what most people in that county didn't know in 1962, was that soil is not a mineral substance. It is a living system, and living systems, even badly damaged ones, can be healed. Eldon had learned this from Albert Howard and William Albrecht, and from something simpler, from watching. From 22 years of renting ground and paying close attention to what happened in the years after a field rested, or after clover came in as a cover crop, or after cattle grazed an area and left their manure behind. He'd noticed things that weren't in any report. He'd noticed that the corners of fields, the places the equipment always skipped, where weeds grew unchecked for years, were the richest, darkest, most crumbly soil on the property. He'd noticed that the smell of good soil was different from the smell of poor soil, and that the smell could come back. Here's what Eldon understood about the Timber Creek Road property that the extension report didn't capture. The soil was acidic and depleted, yes, but it had structure. The subsurface clay was intact. The water table, while high in places, was stable. The creek bottom on the south end had natural organic matter accumulation from a decade of undisturbed vegetation. The land hadn't been farmed in 11 years. The damage was bad, but the foundation was still there. It was not dead, it was dormant. Eldon's plan was meticulous, and it was cheap, and it was slow. He had figured this out over the winter of 1961-62, sitting at his kitchen table with his soil science books and a yellow legal pad covered in calculations. Phase 1, correct the pH. He applied crushed limestone agricultural lime, not the expensive processed kind, at a rate of about 4 tons per acre on the worst portions of the North Field. Not 10 tons as Phelan had suggested. 4. The right reading of the soil told him that was what was needed, applied gradually over 2 seasons. He bought the lime from a quarry near Manhattan, Kansas, and hauled it himself with a used lime spreader he'd purchased for $180, a battered 1955 Viken PTO-driven spreader that he'd rebuilt over the winter in his barn. Phase 2, feed the biology. This is where Eldon's real knowledge came in. He understood before it was fashionable, before it was mainstream, that the key to soil health wasn't just chemistry, it was biology. Specifically, it was microbial life. Healthy soil contains billions of bacteria and fungi per teaspoon, all of them breaking down organic matter, creating nutrients and building the crumb structure that holds moisture and air. Dead soil has almost none of this. You can't buy it. You have to grow it back. His method, Austrian winter peas and hairy vetch, seeded in the fall of 1962 as a cover crop. These are nitrogen-fixing legumes. They pull nitrogen from the air through their root nodules and deposit it in the soil. In the spring, he'd roll them down and let them decompose in place. Free nitrogen, free organic matter, free biology. He also composted. This is where his $1,200 in remaining capital went. He bought 12 loads of cattle manure from a feedlot operation near Louisville at $18 a load, $216 total, and spread it by hand with his son Wayne across the worst sections of the South Field. Not a scientific operation, a backbreaking one. Wayne Marsh, who was 17 years old, later said that winter and spring were the hardest physical work of his life, and also the period when he understood, for the first time, what his father was actually doing. He wasn't just farming, Wayne Marsh said years later, he was building something that wasn't there yet. But Eldon had one more card, a piece of knowledge that came not from books but from a conversation. In the winter of 1962, he drove to Manhattan, Kansas, to visit the Kansas State University Extension Office. He sat down with a soil scientist there named Dr. Raymond Coker, a quiet, bespectacled man who specialized in dryland soil reclamation. Eldon spread his soil test results on the desk and asked one question. "How long?" he said. Dr. Coker studied the numbers. He asked several of his own questions. He looked at Eldon over his glasses. For a full, productive soil profile, he paused. 7 years, maybe 10. Eldon shook his head. "I told a man 3. Coker looked at him for a moment. "What are you going to plant?" Eldon told him. Coker put down his pen. That, he said, might actually work. Because here is what Eldon was planning for 1963, the 3rd year. Alfalfa, not wheat, not corn. Alfalfa, a deep-rooted, nitrogen-fixing perennial legume that in well-managed conditions can produce 4 cuttings per season and dramatically accelerate the recovery of poor soils. It was a crop that most county farmers didn't grow because it required more patience and specific management, but Eldon had done the math. If the limestone brought the pH up to 6.2 or better workable range, and if the cover crops had added meaningful organic matter and biology to the surface layer, then alfalfa, with its 15-foot root system reaching down into the intact subsoil, could thrive where other crops couldn't. And alfalfa in 1963 was selling at the Wamego auction for $28 a ton, with the local dairy operations perpetually short of supply. 3 years, 1 crop, done. The summer of 1963 arrived in Pottawatomie County the way Kansas summers do, sudden and serious, the heat settling in by the first week of June like a guest who doesn't intend to leave. The sky went that hard, bright blue. The wind turned warm and steady from the south. The grain fields around the county were showing well it had been a decent winter for moisture, and by late June the wheat harvest was underway, the combines moving through the fields in long golden lines. Eldon's north field was not wheat. His north field, by the end of June 1963, was alfalfa. Let me tell you what it looked like. If you had driven down Timber Creek Road in the last week of June 1963 and looked to the right, north, you would have seen something that was, in the context of that road and that county's memory of that property, startling. A field of alfalfa in full bloom is a particular sight, dense knee-high, a deep blue-green unlike anything else in the agricultural palette, with little purple flowers across the top that give the whole field a haze of lavender in certain lights. It smells sweet and green and alive, like clover but richer. This was not a thin stand. This was not a struggling crop scratching for purchase in bad dirt. This was, by any objective standard, an excellent stand of alfalfa on ground that 2 years ago had been declared biologically dead. Eldon had seeded it in April with a 1947 John Deere Model B tractor pulling a used Van Brunt grain drill, a machine he'd bought for $90 at a farm auction near Westmoreland. He'd done his final lime application the previous October. The cover crop had decomposed beautifully over the winter, dark and fragrant, when he turned the top inch with a field cultivator, the kind of dark that takes your breath when you've been working to create it for 2 years. He'd walked the field every 3 days from April through June, watching. He'd noted the germination. It was excellent, better than he'd projected. He'd noted the color coming in even across the slope, which told him the pH correction had held. He'd taken a soil sample in May and sent it to the extension office. When the results came back, he sat at his kitchen table and read the numbers twice. pH 6.4, organic matter 2.1%, up from 0.8 in 2 years. Dr. Coker at K-State, when Eldon called to share the results, said, "Well, I'll be damned." He said it quietly and with genuine scientific surprise. He asked if he could come see the field. But before Dr. Coker came, before any of that, something else happened. It was the 3rd week of July. Eldon was making his first cut. He'd borrowed a New Holland 469 Haybane, a mower conditioner, relatively new technology in 1963, from his neighbor Harold Specht, a decent man who had believed from the beginning, or at least kept his doubts to himself. The Haybane moved through the alfalfa with that particular crackling, ripping sound of fresh green stems being cut and folded through the conditioning rollers. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and grassy and alive, the kind of smell that makes you feel, without being able to explain why, that things are right with the world. Wayne Marsh, now 18, ran the Haybane. Eldon walked behind it. He did not need to walk behind it. There was nothing to check, but he walked behind it anyway, slowly, hands in his pockets, watching the windrows curl off the machine. He had the look, his son later said, of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time and was now choosing to experience it slowly. They baled 3 days later with a New Holland 66 baler square bales, 50-pound each, and stacked them in the field with a wagon and an accumulator grapple. When the count was done, Eldon walked it twice to make sure. First cutting, 187 bales, approximately 4.7 tons per acre on the 23 harvested acres. 4.7 tons per acre on ground that had been declared dead. The county average for alfalfa that year, on good, established ground, was 3.1 tons per acre. Now here is where the story turns public, here is where the silence begins. Eldon had been selling his alfalfa before the first cutting was even complete. He'd taken a sample bale to the Waimgo livestock auction the week before, a beautiful, dense, dark green bale that smelled like the best of June, and the buyer for the St. Mary's Dairy Cooperative, a man named Ken Hulstetter, had looked at it, bent down and smelled it, pulled it apart with his hands, and offered Eldon $31 a ton, $3 above market. He wanted all of it, and he wanted a contract for the following year. That auction house was not a private place. By the time Eldon's wagon came into Waimgo with the first load, 40 bales stacked high, that deep green color almost shocking against the blue summer sky, there were already people watching. Not a crowd, but enough. A few farmers from the east end of the county who'd heard the Hulstetter story, Harold Specht, 2 men from the extension office. And as it happened, Gerald Phelan, who had come to town for a bank errand and found himself, without quite planning to, standing on the sidewalk in front of the Waimgo Farm Supply, watching Eldon Marsh's truck roll past. Phelan looked at the bales. He looked at them for a long moment, the way a man looks when his certainty is quietly rearranging itself into something he doesn't want to admit. He said nothing. The silence, when it came, was complete. Not just Phelan's silence, the silence of an entire community recalculating. The story of Eldon Marsh's alfalfa field spread through Pottawatomie County the way all genuine agricultural surprises do, through direct observation, through auction house gossip, through the phone calls between neighbors that constitute the nervous system of a farming community. By August of 1963, people were driving down Timber Creek Road just to look. By September, when Eldon was finishing his third cutting, an astonishing achievement for a first-year alfalfa stand in northeastern Kansas, the looks had become something else, not just curiosity, something closer to respect. Dale Furches, the extension agent who had written the 1958 soil report describing the land as unsuitable for productive agriculture, drove out in late August. He walked the field with Eldon for almost 2 hours. He took notes. He took photographs with a Kodak camera. He pulled up an alfalfa plant by the roots, the whole root system 3 feet long and dense with fine root hairs, alive all the way down, and held it in both hands and looked at it. "I wouldn't have believed it," Furches said. "I'm standing here looking at it and I'm working to believe it." "The soil wasn't dead," Eldon said. "It was hungry." That line, "the soil was hungry, not dead," was later repeated in a brief article in the Kansas Farm Bureau newsletter in October 1963, a small item about innovative soil reclamation practices in Pottawatomie County. It was the first time Eldon Marsh's name appeared in print in connection with this work. It would not be the last. And Gerald Phelan. He stopped talking. That is the most significant thing. A man who had performed his skepticism publicly and loudly, who had told the hardware store and the co-op and his own depositors that Eldon Marsh was foolish and the soil was dead, that man simply stopped bringing it up. He became, on the subject of Eldon Marsh and the Timber Creek Road property, completely and conspicuously silent. He did not apologize, men like that rarely do, but he didn't need to. His silence was its own statement, and in a small county everyone heard it. One morning in September, Eldon pulled into the Waimgo Farm Supply for baler twine. Phelan was there. They stood at the counter 2 feet apart and Phelan said, "Morning, Eldon." He did not ask about the field. He did not bring up the feed store conversation from 18 months earlier. Eldon said, "Morning, Gerald." He paid for his twine and left. That was all. Some reckonings don't need words. Let me tell you what grew from that first cutting, not just the alfalfa, everything else. By the end of the 1963 season, Eldon Marsh had harvested 3 cuttings of alfalfa from 23 acres of the north field, plus additional hay from a second area he'd reclaimed on the south field. Total revenue $2,890, against a total investment over 3 years, land, lime, seed, equipment, labor of approximately $9,800. The property was not yet profitable, but it was producing, it was alive. By 1965, 2 years later, Eldon had expanded his alfalfa stand to 61 acres. He had a standing contract with the St. Mary's Dairy Cooperative and a second buyer, a horse operation near Ulmer, Kansas, who paid a premium for the quality. His annual revenue from the property exceeded $7,400. He had paid off his total investment. By 1968, the Timber Creek Road property was one of the most productive alfalfa operations in the county. The soil organic matter in the North Field had climbed to 3.4%. The pH held steady at 6.5 to 6.7. Eldon had begun rotating sections of the field into oats and back into alfalfa, a practice that continued to build organic matter year over year. He was visited that year by a team from Kansas State University, including Dr. Raymond Coker and 2 graduate students, who spent 2 days on the property, taking extensive soil samples and measurements. Their findings were written up as a case study in a 1969 K-State Extension publication on dryland soil reclamation. The publication cited the Marsh property as a demonstration that severely depleted, highly acidic soils in the eastern Kansas region could be restored to productivity within 3 to 5 years through the systematic application of agricultural lime, leguminous cover cropping, and organic matter amendment, without significant capital expenditure. The cost to restore that soil, by their calculation, is $43 per acre over 3 years. Dr. Coker later said in an interview that the Marsh case changed how he taught soil restoration to his students. We had been telling farmers that severely depleted soil required either massive inputs or abandonment, he said. Eldon Marsh demonstrated a third option: patience and biology. Wayne Marsh, Eldon's son, went on to study agriculture at K-State, partly on the strength of what he had seen and done on that farm as a teenager. He graduated in 1967, worked briefly for the Extension Service, and eventually returned to Pottawatomie County to farm alongside his father. He later said that the 3 years of building that soil, the hauling of manure, the spreading of lime, the slow watching of cover crops decompose into something dark and living, was his real education. My father never called it reclamation, Wayne said. He just called it farming. He said soil farming and crop farming aren't the same thing. Crop farmers grow plants, soil farmers grow the ground. He was a soil farmer. Eldon Marsh farmed the Timber Creek Road property until 1981, when he retired at the age of 71 and transferred ownership to Wayne. He died in 1987, in the farmhouse he'd built on the property in 1964, a simple white frame house with a porch that faced the north field. People who visited in his last years said that on good evenings, you could sometimes find him on that porch, watching the alfalfa in the late light, and that he had the look of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. The property, all 160 acres, was assessed in 1985 at $187,000. He had bought it for $8,000. And Gerald Fellan, he remained at the First National Bank of Wamego until his retirement in 1979. He was, by all accounts, a capable banker. He never spoke publicly about the Marsh farm again, but those who knew him said that in the last years of his career he was notably quieter in his assessments of what was possible and what was not. Whether that was wisdom or just age is hard to say. Maybe there's not much difference. Let me pause here near the end of this story and ask you something. When did you last look at something and call it dead because it looked dead? When did you last make a public statement about what someone else couldn't do, not because you had examined the evidence carefully, but because the numbers in the report said so, because the conventional wisdom said so, because it was easier and more comfortable to be the person who knew the limits than the person who tested them? This is not a criticism. Gerald Fellan was not a villain. He was a capable man who looked at a set of facts, a real soil report, real pH numbers, real erosion damage, and drew the reasonable conclusion. The reasonable conclusion was wrong not because the facts were wrong, but because facts are not the whole story. Facts describe what is. Wisdom understands what could be. Eldon Marsh had wisdom that the numbers didn't contain. He had learned through years of observation, through books that most of his neighbors hadn't read, through the particular kind of attention that comes from genuinely loving the work, that soil is not a static thing. It is a living system. It moves, it responds, it can be hurt and it can be healed. He also understood something about time. He had told a man in a feed store that he'd have a crop in 3 years, and he kept that promise, but only because he never wasted a single one of those 3 years waiting for the right moment. The lime went down in the first fall. The cover crops went in the first fall. The manure went on in the first winter. He never stopped working toward the thing he said he would do. There is a particular kind of courage in that, not the loud kind, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, daily, get-up-and-do-it-again kind that is actually the hardest kind. Anyone can be brave for a moment. Eldon Marsh was brave for 3 years of quiet mornings and cold work, and the knowledge that the whole county was watching and some of them were hoping he'd fail. He never acknowledged that pressure, he just worked. The land he bought for $8,000 on a late October afternoon in 1961, land that a banker had publicly called dead, land that an extension agent had officially certified as unsuitable for agriculture, produced hay for 20 years. It put his son through college. It became a case study in a university publication. It changed how a soil scientist taught restoration to the next generation of agricultural students. All of that grew from 160 acres that nobody wanted. All of that grew from one man who knew the difference between dead and dormant. And maybe that's the thing to take from this story, not just the farming lesson, as real and practical as that lesson is, but the wider one. That the things and the people and the situations that others have written off, that have been certified as finished, as too far gone, as not worth the investment, sometimes they're not dead. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone patient enough and knowledgeable enough and stubborn enough to help them grow. Sometimes all they needed was someone who still believed. Don't judge the field in October, wait for June. Historical context is real. Characters and dialogue are dramatized for storytelling purposes.